All right. Welcome to Rackspace Office Hours Hangout. I'm Drew, and we do this every week. This week, we've got a really exciting topic because we're piggybacking off of a Twitter chat that happened earlier today. That Twitter chat really talked about multi-cloud and hybrid cloud and what that really means in the environment and ecosystem. There are plenty of people doing plenty of things, and that was made very, very obvious in paying attention to that chat and what was going on in that ecosystem. So without further ado, I'm joined by one of the participants in that chat. This is Agla, and she is part of the Rackspace family here, and also part of the OpenStack community. And thank you for joining us. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Thank you for having me. I'm an 8-year racker, and I am working on our OpenStack team. Besides my full-time job at Rackspace, I am also one of the directors on OpenStack Foundation, and as part of that job, I co-chair a OpenStack Interop Committee, and that takes up a lot of our time. And I was actually really happy to see the multi-cloud chat come up, because that's what our work at Interop work group is all about.
Absolutely, and that puts you in a great position to have this conversation about what leveraging more than one cloud in whatever way that turns out to be works. And so that's a really key position to be in. Why don't you talk a little bit about that first question? So one of the things that we covered in the chat was to really be sure we understood the terms. We had the two different prevailing terms that you hear when you talk about multiple clouds, and that's hybrid cloud, which may have a different definition than multi-cloud. And we wanted to kind of get to the bottom of where the differences are, if there are any, and if that's even important. So the very first conversation and question that got started was, what's the difference? What's the definition of these two things? And does it matter? So what is your viewpoint on having multiple clouds and the multi-cloud versus hybrid cloud terminology?
So the ultimate answer is, I don't think the definitions matter too much. The difference between the two I don't know that there is a huge difference. I think they overlap. The way I think about it, I think of it as hybrid cloud being a subset of multi-cloud. And multi-cloud would be just that. It involves multiple different clouds. For example, AWS, Rackspace, Azure, Google. If you're running things on those things, you are using multi-cloud. Hybrid cloud, I would see it as a subset, but in a more narrow sense, it would be if you are running things on your hosted environment and all of a sudden you're having a huge event and you need to scale your application, and so you would scale into the public cloud. So that would be like one use case. But ultimately, it's more about just using different clouds and how you use them. I did have someone disagree with me on my definitions, and after a while I realized that it's because I work and live in this hosted environment, and all my work is about hosted and cloud and all of that. I don't have a sense of on-prem. So for me, on-prem is the same as hosted.
Right.
If it's dedicated gear, it's hosted. But for some people, there's a huge difference. But when you think about it, even if you're running everything on-prem, you could be running private cloud.
Absolutely.
You're on private cloud. So
a lot of people have VMware installations on-prem.
Exactly. Yeah. Now we're also seeing OpenStack, and some people have both OpenStack and VMware on-prem. Right. So that makes a multi-cloud, and it's probably hybrid too, because I bet the applications share those environments without even users being aware of that.
Yeah, a lot of times there's a big database that all sorts of apps need to use because there's important information in there. But those apps may have been built at different times on different tools, but they communicate back to that one same data store.
Exactly.
So that's a great example of that kind of situation.
Exactly. So ultimately, I don't think the definition is that important. It's more about how you use your cloud and how many clouds you have to manage.
That can get a little bit overwhelming. Now, I think it does matter as long as you've defined what terms you're going to use in that conversation. It is really useful to say, for this conversation, we're going to call this specific thing hybrid cloud, and here's what that means. And we'll call this multi-cloud, because you don't want to have a situation where you're 20, 30, 40 minutes into a conversation, a full day of whiteboarding in, before you realize that you've both been talking, using the same words, talking about different things.
Sure, and that's exactly it. For as long as you use the same vocabulary and hopefully you're talking about the same things, then it all works great. Just like that gentleman that disagreed with me on Twitter, I realized that that's exactly was it. We were not talking about exactly the same thing.
The solutions are still valid. It's just a different way of terminology and a different way of tagging that specific approach. The approaches still work. It's just how are you defining and naming those things?
Exactly.
Well, there were definitely a few camps, a lot of different nuances, but in 140 characters, flying by at the pace that the conversation was going, it was hard to get a complete picture of what the ecosystem might think of what hybrid could be versus what multi-cloud could be. I think multi-cloud forces the conversation to be you're using more than one cloud technology.
Yeah.
That may not be self-hosted. That may be just you have some SaaS provider that does a specific thing and everything else is a different cloud tool. But the words define the final definition, whereas hybrid seems like you have a few more things you could parse out to be more specific.
Right. And one of someone else I saw tweet that users don't really care about multi-cloud. And you know what? It's true. If you're using cloud as a consumer, if you're deploying your application to one environment, you probably don't care how many clouds or what kind of cloud. You probably care more about it if you have to manage all of that.
The outcome at the end of the day is the most important thing. The business why you're doing any of that is the most compelling piece. As long as your end users get what you promise, then you've succeeded.
Exactly.
That gets more and more complicated as you approach multi-cloud or hybrid cloud with a broader and broader view. But as long as the solutions are put forward to your end users, things are good. Right. So that kind of directs us to question number 2. And so we're going to have Tyler put that one up on the screen, and we'll talk about the next question that everybody discussed here. So how did you end up in a multi-cloud environment? And I'd always thought of this kind of from the shadow IT perspective. And there were some people mentioning that where, you start out with one plan that's agreed upon by the company, and then business units and different departments say, we really have a time crunch. We need to get this up and running. And you end up with this ever creeping scope in the cloud world. So that's the way I'd always thought about it. But there's a lot of different people who propose different ways you could end up there. What do you see most often?
So I don't know that I am a typical use case here. I am a recovering developer. That means my background is in development. Mm-hmm. And for a while, I developed against VMware vSphere APIs and integrated our customer portal with that, and got to experience cloud from at a different level than most people would. Yeah. So I had great experience working with that. And then when we Rackspace really started working on OpenStack, I had a chance to move to our OpenStack team, and I've been working on that ever since. So to me, the technology is not as important as it's more about what you use it for. Mm-hmm. And so what we see, or what I have seen, people that really like VMware products, they probably will stick with them because that's what they like. But even if they like it, sometimes they're like, oh, the costs are too much. We need to move it. And they see OpenStack as the free VMware option. And while they're not exactly the same, and they're good at their own things, some people move to OpenStack exactly because it is free and open source.
Right.
At Rackspace, we're in a position to offer both, and we have options for people to work on both. And we see the advantages and disadvantages of uh, running on one cloud or on multiple clouds. And I'm sure we have multiple customers that have footprints in all of the different clouds we support.
Well, absolutely. And we've seen with a lot of the organizations that put these forward with OpenStack, with Amazon, with VMware, with Microsoft, interoperability has been really important. I think VMware just announced at the end of the year a big partnership with AWS, making the ability to leverage both far more streamlined and providing a lot of tooling around that. And that's a conversation that all cloud providers have been moving towards, either slowly or quickly. And we're seeing a lot of growth around that conversation and a lot of tooling built, because people who have solutions that are already built and have plans to build new things aren't necessarily seeing those things built in the same way on the same platform because of things like specific features or cost or whatever the case may be. Their future state is going to require more than one solution. And so there are certainly people who look at the broad ecosystem and say, it'd be really nice to build the next app in a public cloud. And it'd be really nice to not have to forklift off all the work we've already done in VMware and continue to mature that and improve that a piece at a time, instead of having to shove everything into a new solution, grow steadily with these new offerings. There's so many new offerings that there's always going to be a new compelling option, a new compelling thing to play with. And I think one of the conversations I saw was about doing things for tech's sake or doing things for a business case. And a lot of new technologies are really exciting to go play with. But if there's not a valid business reason to say, okay, we're going to shift into this new technology, then there's not a compelling. It's just fun. It's not business necessitated. And so to be able to draw that direct line and say, because this is going to be cheaper to do the same thing we're doing, or because it's got a feature that we don't currently have, let's make this move, is a very different conversation. And that's planning on making yourself multi-cloud. But a lot of people find themselves in multi-cloud. And M&A was one of the big ways that was brought up, where a lot of customers have had a merger. There's a new company in town and they've done something completely differently. And now you're all under one roof. So how do you make that work? And that was a thing that it makes sense. Of course, that's the kind of thing that would happen. But it was kind of enlightening to me to see how many people kind of raise their hand and say, oh yeah, me too. That's definitely something that's happened to make us multi-cloud.
Yeah, definitely. I think most companies are multi-cloud just because users will go and seek out the easiest cloud to use. And what's not necessarily the best cloud, it's what's the easiest to consume, what's the easiest to deploy to, and what's the easiest to get access to. If I give you one perfect cloud, but you have to jump through hoops to get access to it, to deploy something to it, and then we have the so-so cloud that you don't have to talk to anyone, you can just use it. Which one are you going to use?
Probably the one that gets you the time to market.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of companies find themselves in those positions, and that's where they're like, oh, we need a multi-cloud strategy. We need a strategy how to manage all of this, because with all of this freedom to get your hands onto any cloud, you also need some way to know what's going on and how you're going to manage all of your things that are in all of those clouds, and are they secure?
Yeah, there's a lot of discipline required with all of that freedom, and that makes the conversation much harder. I think security is one of those that it's a double-edged sword. If you have stuff spread across multiple clouds, it's going to be harder for it all to get compromised, but you also have a much broader attack vector and more to maintain. So there's another one of those kind of balancing acts that people have to do.
Absolutely. I think the only way your things are going to be secure if they're not connected to internet in any sort of way, and nobody has physical access to it either. So, but then you wouldn't be able to use it.
Yeah, that's the best way forward if it was feasible, and I don't think it's feasible. I was listening, someone was talking about the presidential phone. I think there's a lot of talk about presidential stuff, but it's just for communication. It's not a smartphone. It doesn't connect to the internet. And it's, if you're going to keep it secure, it has to be that way. But if you want it to be usable, there's going to be some trade-offs there.
Hey, when was it that you used your phone for actually calling someone?
It's rare. It's real rare. And I use like WhatsApp or something like that to do half the calling I do. So anyhow, there's a lot of other things that came up. You talked about ease of use being a big deal, and time to market. So being able to quickly deploy resources without a whole lot of headache, that really speaks to a specific user group's requirements. But there were a couple of other user groups that were brought up, like government and like banking or healthcare, where they have specific compliance requirements. And so while all of these things are important, cost is important, speed of deployment is important, ease of use, sometimes it's security being the most important thing, or compliance being the most important thing that really drives what gets adopted where, be it a SaaS offering or be it a platform to build from. And so that's one of the places that this multi-cloud conversation gets incredibly complex. There's not just one factor, but usually a customer knows, or a company knows, this is the most important thing, and that's going to define where the bulk of their work goes and where the next step goes.
Absolutely. As soon as you have to deal with something that requires incredible security, your cloud game is going to get incredibly challenging.
Absolutely.
And you have to embrace it. You still have to use it, but how you're going to let your developers access it, or how you're going to protect it, you better have some really good security people and some really good process in place. And I think most banking companies, they probably are known for just that they're very good on process and very strict on that.
Yeah, and you want to keep the best talent on the development side who wants to use the tools that are quick and easy. And so you have that tension in those sorts of organizations where you want to provide your developers with the tools that are going to make them happy, keep them there, let them do their best work. But you're dealing with such important data that you have to be incredibly careful about how you approach providing that. And so it's really a crucial conversation to have, and to go into it eyes wide open. And some people just find themselves in a multi-cloud environment and have to back into compliance and discipline and a lot of those other things. And that really creates some of the big struggles.
I think a lot of those companies would probably choose to go with their own private clouds. And that's where we see great OpenStack adoption, even VMware private clouds as well. But that's the beauty of having all of these different tools.
Yeah, the ecosystem.
You can have your own cloud.
You can
multiple ones,
more than one of them if you need it.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I think there's a lot of ways that we saw people finding themselves in a multi-cloud or hybrid cloud solution. But once you're there, you get to that pros and cons conversation. So that's where the conversation on Twitter ended up, is what are the big pros involved? So Tyler's going to throw that third question up there. What are the pros of a multi-cloud environment? There were plenty of people talking about what you get if you do it well. And you had a couple of interesting thoughts. I'll let you kind of share your view of the big pros in a multi-cloud environment.
I think one of the biggest pro is flexibility and ease of use. I guess it's two biggest ones. As a developer, I love the idea of having the flexibility of deploying my application to whether it's the most convenient, or it's going to be accessible to the most users, or maybe something that has a tremendous amount of storage that I need access to. And so just having that flexibility, it just makes me happy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I think that's probably the biggest pro of having multi-cloud and having access to that. And fortunately, as a hacker, I always had access to all these different clouds. And now that we support Amazon, I can go to AWS as well, and I can use whatever I like. And as part of OpenStack, we also want to make sure that you can deploy your application to different OpenStack deployments. For those that are not familiar with OpenStack, you can deploy your own OpenStack private cloud, and you can customize it to you can customize everything. And that's good and bad. It's good. It's bad because that means your OpenStack cloud might look very different from my OpenStack cloud. It's good. Well, it's customizable. So
Mhm.
we have a work group in place to make sure that OpenStack is consistent for at least a major subset of main uses and applications.
Yeah. I mean, you can go to a car dealership and buy a Camry that's going to be just like every other Camry built that year, but it's not going to have any of the special, bells and whistles. But if you want to go and get a buy a car and soup it up and make it a hot rod or something, you're going to have to go in and do specific things. But that car is going to drive a lot faster than the Camry. Now,
I
you
love
take it
that
to a mechanic,
analogy.
you have to take it to the right mechanic. You can't take it to anybody to
No.
work on. And so you're going to have trade-offs there too. And I think about what you're talking about with tools, and what's available and what you can actually get done. I remember, like, right out of college, I think I had a hammer and a wrench and a screwdriver, and I didn't really like working on projects. But as
And
I've
you built
grown
a
up,
cloud?
I didn't build any clouds. I broke more things than I built. But as you go to the hardware store 3 or 4 times every project, you come home with another tool.
Yep.
I really enjoy working on projects now because I know I can go to the garage and I can grab the right tool for that job and not have to, try to force some tool that's not meant to do that thing. And with tools like OpenStack that are so flexible and Amazon that have so many new features coming out all the time, you're really looking at all of these tools that are right at your disposal. And a developer can say, I think we could probably solve this if we had oh, there it is. That's the tool I need.
Yep.
Grab it and go and have a solution much more quickly. And that's really the name of the game, is to be able to iterate more quickly and provide features to your end users at a faster pace than your competition, and to be able to do that in a stable, secure, and repeatable way. And so that's
Exactly.
really exciting. There were some other things in the pros category. People talking about your typical HA or DR solutions, and that goes. You can do that within most cloud platforms, but people are getting sophisticated enough with what they're doing that they can now be like vendor DR and vendor HA, so that one vendor may have a problem that is pervasive across their environment, and you have another solution in place.
Exactly. If you have your application running somewhere in the cloud, hopefully it is resilient enough and agnostic enough where it doesn't matter what cloud and what provider it's running onto. And if, for example, something happens to the cloud you're running onto, it can seamlessly move to the next one.
Mhm.
And I think that most of the web development is going that way already, if it's not there yet.
Yeah.
Because we all know things happen. And yes, today it's this cloud and tomorrow is the next cloud, and where there's going to be outages and other cloudy things happening that we don't like, right? And
Yeah.
you can't really say, oh, it's only Rackspace that's the best cloud, or Amazon is perfect, it never goes down. Well, that's not true.
Right.
Things happen.
They do.
So you want to make sure that your app can run on any of these clouds, and hopefully you have a strategy in place where, like, if things happen, if you need more load or more storage or something, you can just move to them.
Well, and it's not only in case of a problem. You could also see the price just went down on the similar device at another vendor. I can save money by deploying there next time or now. Or maybe there's a higher horsepower version of this same solution that I can go ahead and deploy, and my performance is going to go up whatever percentage, and that's going to make my end users happier. And so when you can deploy in multiple different locations and multiple different vendors, that gives you the ability to take advantage of not only moving out of the way of a problem, but moving into the way of a better solution. And so that flexibility can really help you amplify the value that you're getting out of the code by putting it on a platform that's going to be best fit. That's tailoring a solution instead of taking the solution that comes by default wherever you start, being able to pivot around.
I agree. I don't think anybody can really afford to just run on one single cloud, whether it's cost or flexibility. There's always going to be a cheaper cloud, but there's times when you really can't afford to run on the cheapest cloud. So
Right.
you have to pick and choose.
Well, I think a lot of this conversation has been on the macro level about infrastructure as a service or private cloud and things along those lines. But when you start thinking about platforms and software as a service, you're thinking about people who focus on one thing and they have their expertise that they bring to the table, and they manage a lot of the back end components that make that work and take that headache and that workload off of your teams and off of your infrastructure. And so I think if it's only SaaS as your other cloud, there's still no reason not to be a multi-cloud organization, because somebody is really focused at a specific security thing or a specific feature. They do it really well, and it's one less thing for you to worry about. And you can take advantage of their expertise and their management of that infrastructure without having to burden your teams with that particular work.
Exactly. As I mentioned earlier, developers really don't care where their infrastructure is or how it's running. For as long as it's up and they can get to it, that's really all they care about.
Yeah. So however you can get that done, you're gonna see value. There's one last question, which is the obvious other side of the coin. We talked about what the pros are, but we're gonna put that up on the screen. What are the cons of the multi-cloud environment?
Security.
That I think is the big one. I think
Security and complexity. I think security is the one that I saw the most, and it's extremely difficult to do security well, especially on very complex environments where everybody and anybody have access to all these different things.
Right.
So how you're going to manage your security is something you have to answer before you go this multi-cloud route. And if you haven't thought about it yet, you better do it now.
Yeah, I think the camps where they found themselves in a multi-cloud environment instead of intentionally moved towards a multi-cloud approach, it's incredibly important for them to look at security now, because it wasn't part of the planning process. If you're moving into it, you can bake that in to your approach and to your strategy. But if you you're just minding your own business and an email comes from a different department that says, oh yeah, here in our Google Compute Cloud solution, we're doing this. And you say, I didn't know we even had that. What does that mean? What are the implications? You really have to understand all of the pieces that you have in play, what it takes to secure those things. And I think that's the fear that a lot of customers that I talk to is finding out that they have some piece to the puzzle that they weren't sure existed, and that it isn't secure and doesn't sit within their regulatory rules.
Yeah,
and that
the
kind of thing.
surprise you have yet another cloud. I think that's a big one and a big concern for everyone. But as I mentioned earlier, developers like easy. So if that other cloud is easy and the one you give them is not, they will still go to the easy cloud.
Yeah, you may end up in a situation where you're drug forward into a multi-cloud approach because there are parts of your organization that see a better way forward than your strategy has brought. But you still have to marry your business requirements to that cloud. And so that's where a difficult conversation needs to happen, where you're saying, okay, I see the value that you're proposing, but you have to see the struggle that brings. And let's find a way to give you what you need while you provide what we need, so that the organization can collaborate forward instead of kind of battle and grind down to a stalemate, because then you're not delivering that end goal, that solution that you're intending to. Well, we had all sorts of people in this chat. There was far more than I could keep up with, and I had an hour to go and review after the chat ended, and I was a little bit overwhelmed by the pace of it all. But a lot of interesting things did stick out. We've talked about a lot of them, but were there maybe a couple of specific things that kind of turned a light on for you, or that you really think ought to be highlighted that isn't discussed as much in this type of a conversation?
I think we covered the main things, the main ones. I think this was great discussion, but people were just talking from their perspective, and there was no differentiation. Okay, is this multi-cloud chat for consumers of cloud? Is it for infrastructure people? Is it for ops? Is it for developers? Because if I am looking at this from my ops perspective, I may say, I don't want multi-cloud.
Yeah.
In fact, it makes my life difficult.
Yeah.
Make it single cloud,
Mhm.
right? If I am a developer, like, why? No, I really still don't care. Give me just access to the
Mhm.
one, to the one that's easiest to access and easiest to consume and easiest to write tools
Right.
against. And if I am a vendor looking to deploy my own private cloud, well, it's a whole other discussion, right?
Mhm.
It's about how you're going to manage your cloud and where is it going to be, not just up in the sky, hopefully,
Right.
and how am I going to restrict security and all of those different things. I'm sure I'm missing out a few other.
Well, there was a lot
perspectives.
of perspectives that were shared in that conversation. I think that was one of the most compelling pieces. Is you never really knew where the next viewpoint was going to come from, and there were. It's going to be a debate, and there's always going to be a way you can defend your approach. There was a couple people talking about their single cloud approach that they'd consolidated and said, this is the cloud we're going to go with moving forward. It's a blog that I've pinned and I'm going to go back and read. But you can certainly say, look, we standardized on this. We got really good at it. We're focused on it. And everything else can happen wherever it happens, but the complexity is lower for us. And that's the value that we see. We've decided that the cost is worth it and all of that, but we'll focus on keeping our complexity down. And that's what we value most. You'll look at the government requirement, and that's a different government cloud is a different set of requirements that they have to look at what their needs are. And so, yeah, we had Jeff DeVerter and John Ingates, a couple other rackers that were part of that conversation as well. Jeff focuses on Microsoft and John Ingates is our CTO. So between the three of you, y'all have different perspectives, even from the Rackspace point of view, looking at this multi-cloud environment. So the three of you could have had an interesting conversation, but then you bring in all of these other organizations and people from very different viewpoints.
Exactly.
An ops person versus a developer versus a decision maker on the business strategy side. Wow. I mean, those are all relevant, but very different views on this subject.
Yeah, no, I think we'll continue seeing these conversations about multi-cloud and hybrid cloud. And one conversation I am really looking forward to seeing and hopefully happens soon is about multi-cloud security. I think John Ingates brought that one up, and I think that one would be excellent to hear. I would love to hear from experts in that area.
Yeah, just keeping up with security on a single platform can be a full-time job. And as you get more complex, it's just mind-boggling the kinds of problems that can exist as complexity grows. So that's a great conversation that we'll keep an eye on. You can check this out next week. The chat is going to happen again next week with the hashtag multi-cloud chat. And then this show will happen next week also, where we'll recap that portion of this conversation as it grows. So there's a lot to dig through. If you're watching this further in the future, you've seen this recorded, feel free to go back into Twitter and search for that hashtag and see the conversation as it developed. There's a lot of really interesting perspective in there. And then next week, as the chat comes back up, participate, get involved in that discussion and help mold kind of the way people are thinking about this multi-cloud world, because it's only getting more complicated, and there's becoming more and more viewpoints that are relevant and that are involved in this conversation. So make your voice one of those. We'll be covering this again next week, talking about what comes of the next conversation. But I think that about does it. There's a lot we could dig into, and we could talk about very specific tweets. But I think from a broad perspective, there's more to cover than you could cover in 140 characters, which is where we got here. And then there's more to cover here than we'll be able to cover today. But that's why for the rest of February, on Thursdays, we're going to be having these multi-cloud chats on Twitter at, I believe it's 11 Eastern, and then 10 Eastern. And then this is at 12 Eastern. We're in Central Time, so I'm trying to transpose while we're talking. So that's the way things are going to be going for the month of February. We're excited about the rest of the conversation and hearing more about what people are thinking in relation to a multi-cloud approach. approach. And I think that's about all we have for today. If you have any other thoughts, please share them with us. We'll be on Twitter, keeping an eye on this conversation, and happy to engage with people as they bring their questions and opinions and viewpoints to this discussion. So I think that's about it. We'll sign off. Thank you all for joining us for this recap and continued conversation, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.